21ª Cátedra Europa, el encuentro académico y cultural del Caribe colombiano y el mundo académico europeo. Europa se vive en el Caribe.
I'm sorry that I can't speak Spanish, so I have to present my little paper in English, but I provided some main points, and a colleague of ours was so kind to give a short summary in Spanish, which will follow after my presentation. And in order to help you not to fall asleep, I have provided a few slides which you may like to enjoy while I'm talking. Just one final little remark. The title, The Port of Hamburg and the Hamburg-America line in the era of mass migration. The word Hamburg-America line is not quite correct when we talk about the foundation of Hapag, because the shipping company was founded in 1847 under the name of Hapag. And this is a horrible word for the English-speaking world, because it means Hamburg-America Paketfahrt Schifffahrtsgesellschaft. So under the auspices of Berlin, and I'm talking about Berlin later on, they changed the name for the time being in Hamburg-America line, which was much more convenient for, first of all, for the English-speaking world. But now, as you can see later on, you will hear from a representative from Hapag-Lloyd, and nowadays it's again Hapag-Lloyd. Okay. The British blockade of the River Elbe. You know all that Hamburg is situated on the River Elbe. Probably you've seen the presentation yesterday by Dirk Schubert, so you know where we are. So the British blockade of the River Elbe directed against the French and the continental system imposed by Napoleon against Britain severely interrupted Hamburg's trade and industry. We are talking about the 1810s to 1815s. Hamburg was hard hit by both embargoes. Maritime trade came to a standstill, and many of the inhabitants were out of work. Only 60 unrigged sailing vessels lay in the port, and about 50 blue water sailors remained operational, several presumably under British flag. In 1814, they returned to Hamburg because 1814 was about the end of the Napoleonic War, although the final defeat was in 1815. But in 1815, the first returned to Hamburg. A further 150 to 200 vessels were sold abroad after 1806. Thus, overseas trade was not resumed and extended immediately after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and mainly as a result of liberation of Latin America from colonial powers. That was the first more important focus of the first trades. Brazil occupied an increasingly important role among the overseas trading partners. In about 1830, it supplied almost half of Hamburg's sugar imports and 30% of its coffee imports. In about 1840, overseas shipping enjoyed a healthy boom with the onset of emigration. Here you see a picture from the 1850s of people trying to leave Europe or Germany from Hamburg, and they were taken with tenders to the big sailing vessels which were moored in the river. I'm talking about the mooring of vessels in Hamburg in a second. So since the 1830s, immigrant vessels, sailing vessels had been plying regularly between Hamburg and New York, and with the development of new trade relations on the west coast of America, in the Far East, in Australia and Africa. In spite of the increasing trading figures with North and South America, the exchange of goods with overseas countries in 1835 accounted only to 10% of the total volume of Hamburg's trade. Trade with Africa and Southeast Asia only slowly became more important in the middle of the 19th century. Britain remained, for the time being, the biggest trading partner of Hamburg. After 1814, in addition to colonial goods, Hamburg imported British industrial products such as cotton, fabrics, steam engines, iron, and later railway lines. When the German Customs Union was founded in 1834, as a protection against goods from abroad, the Hanseatic cities did not join. Hanseatic city means Hamburg, Bremen, and Lübeck on the Baltic. Hamburg merchants, brokers, insurance companies, banks, forwarding agents, and warehouses firms were interested in foreign trade and did not want to give up the benefits of the free port. The trading houses in the Altstadt and the Wandram Island provided proof of the prosperity of merchants. The small craftsmen's workshops were engaged in the processing of colonial goods. In Hamburg, Hamburg possessed hardly any industry worth mentioning until the second half of the 19th century. Brazil was the mainstay of its trade with South America. The most important goods were sugar, followed by coffee, tobacco, nuts, and rubber. The growing demand in European countries for animal products such as skins, tallow, meat extract, and tinned meat led to at the end of the 19th century to a very brisk trade with Uruguay and Argentina. The development of the Hamburg-Südamerikanische Schifffahrtsgesellschaft, founded in 1871, proceeded hand in hand with the expansion of the trade with these three countries after 1871. Trade with the west coast of America first centered on guano. Guano, as bird droppings in deposits up to 20 meters high, was mainly used as fertilizers. In the 1870s, these stocks were exhausted, and now came the demand for saltpeter or nitrate. This was also used as fertilizer, but also required for the production of dynamite. The Hamburg saltpeter trade with Chile became increasingly important. In order to compete with the steamship lines, including the DDD Cosmos after 1872, bigger and more robust sailing vessels were built. Now German yachts reached a peak in the history of sail with the Leis 5 masters Potosi and Preußen, the flying P-liners or saltpeter clippers, both built at the Tecklenburg shipyard in Bremerhaven, not in Hamburg. Steam-propelled freighters began to replace sailing vessels in the last 2 decades of the 19th century. They were faster, cheaper, and more reliable, as a calm could not slow them down, which would happened quite often in the age of sailing when there was no wind and the vessels were waiting for promotion. In the West Indies, Hamburg vessels sailed after the 1820s to Puerto Rico and Santo Domingo, and from there returned home with coffee, sugar, tobacco, and tropical woods. Voyages were also made to Haiti, Cuba, Mexico, and Venezuela. And amid the economic crisis of 1857, a sailing shipping line was founded for the trade with Mexico. The cargo carried from Hamburg was mostly mahogany and Campeche wood for the production of dye stuff. The Hapag, later called Hamburg-America Line or HAL, was founded in 1847, completed the transition from sail to steam in about 1870. So within a period of 20 years, the transition from sail to steam was completed. Hapag set up 5-line services to the West Indies, Mexico, Venezuela, and Colombia. Sailing vessels remained only for the Orinoco trade and the transport of rare woods from Lagunas de Terminos in southern Mexico until 1900. Hamburg's North America trade was based on the transport of immigrants in Sloman's sailing vessels from the 1838 onwards and from the Hamburg-America line from 1848. On the return voyages, cotton, tobacco, or meat were transported. The Helena Sloman was in 1850 the first steamer to be commissioned. In 1856, the first Hull steamers, Harmonio and Borussia, followed. Despite these beginnings, Hamburg did not become involved in the lucrative business with emigrants until a relatively late stage, and it took up to 1880 to advance to a leading position. Prior to that, the flow of emigrants had made for the Atlantic ports of Antwerp, Le Havre, and Rotterdam rather than Hamburg. Bremen was the first German port to respond to the waves of emigration. It built new port facilities in Bremerhaven and advanced rapidly to become a flourishing emigration port. In Bremen, ordinances governing eminent affairs were passed as early as 1832. It introduced immigration laws, obliging shipping companies to provide a minimum of food and space on their ships, to prove that their vessels were seaworthy, and to keep passenger lists. This gave the immigrants a certain degree of security as regards board and lodging, and made Bremen attractive to immigrants. Many were able to travel to Bremen on inland waterways and from the late 1840s by train to Bremerhaven. And Bremen, traditionally good trading relations with North America, enjoyed heavily of this transport. The first regular steamship connection between Germany and the US was inaugurated in 1857, the founding year of the North German Lloyd. Bremen became the leading port of departure for German immigrants. Between 1830 and 1975, more than 7 million people left Europe via Bremen. This number was split more evenly between Germans and Eastern Europeans. At first, Hamburg responded hesitantly. Its immigrant numbers were modest. In 1832, it renewed bans on groups of immigrants for fear that impoverished travelers might become a burden on poor relief. As a result, between 1836 and 1850, Hamburg registered only 50,000 immigrants, while Bremen had nearly 300,000 immigrants at the same time. However, Hamburg recognized how beneficial the transportation of immigrants could be to its economy. From 1837, it began organizing immigrant affairs on the same lines as Bremen in the hope of attracting a greater flow of immigrants to Hamburg. The transit passengers' money flowed into the city via diverse routes, to shipping companies and ship owners, to merchants and shipping clerks, to innkeepers and hostel proprietors, to agents and intermediaries, and thence into the municipal coffers by way of income of corporation tax. In 1847, the year in which the Hull was founded, Hamburg adopted more of the Bremen ordinances governing immigration. One ordinance introduced a requirement for statistic and passenger lists. statistics have been kept in Hamburg since 1837. The Hamburg passenger list for the years 1850 to 1934 have been kept preserved in full, complete with precise dates and details. This is a wonderful source for historians and for people who are interested in the history of their families, etc. And it's a marvelous thing. For many years, Hamburg had had a bad reputation as a port of immigration. This was partly due to small-time intermediaries and crooks and dishonest barkeepers who played dirty tricks on simple-minded immigrants. You can imagine these people fleeing from economic and political situations in their home parts, came to Hamburg, which was a city open to the world, and they didn't know really what would happen to them. And they met, of course, people who managed to persuade them to hand over their money, and then they were stranded in Hamburg. And the shipping companies, first of all, Hull, was not interested in shipping those people across to the States, because at the same time, the immigration officers in America would say, well, no, we don't want these people, take them back again. And therefore, apart from the financial situation, it was very important to keep an eye on the health situation, because if the American authorities returned people from entering the country, it fell back to the shipping company, who had to ship them home again. Another reason for the city's bad image was the inadequate accommodation in its crowded hostels and lodgings. Sometimes up to 6 people had to sleep in a single room. To make conditions more tolerable and the city more attractive as a transit station, the Hamburg Association for the Protection of Emigrants were formed in 1850, following the Bremen model. In 1851, the city opened an immigrant evidence office to provide reliable information to immigrants, most of whom arrived by train. The growing influx of immigrants led in 1855 to the establishment of a government department for immigrant affairs, which took over the evidence office as a municipal responsibility, renamed Immigrant Authorities in 1887. A further reason for Hamburg's bad reputation was indirect immigration, which took mainly people to the US via British ports, such as Liverpool. This route was cheaper and usually faster than the direct route from Hamburg, because there were more frequent sailings from Liverpool to the States. This route was more grueling and more dangerous, usually involving a journey by sea to Hull in Great Britain, followed by a transit route to Liverpool and to the ocean-going ships. British rulers governing individual space entitlement, food, sanitary facilities, and medical checks were much less favorable than those in Hamburg and Bremen. The land stage made the journey more strenuous. In addition to that, there were language difficulties. Between 1850 and 1914, nearly 700,000 people chose the indirect route from Hamburg to the New World via other European ports. Emigrants had become a major economic factor. They were an exotic article, a commodity, a bulk. Seaports like Hamburg were immigrant transshipment centers. Ocean-going vessels brought goods to Germany, among them raw materials such as cotton, tobacco, rice, and rubber. The finished goods, such as linen and glass, were transported to America, required less space. So there was room for the transport of immigrants. Tween decks could be removed for the passage from west to east, were installed between the upper deck and the cargo hold. In the age of sail, conditions on the tween decks were calamitous. I'll give you a few pictures. These are the people entering from a tender to a steamer in the 1870s. This is a picture, or various pictures, of the life aboard, which are the more enjoyable parts of the journey, not really depicting the horrible situation in the tween decks. This is a picture from the 1870s showing how people lived in the tween decks. And you have to imagine passengers were not allowed to leave the tween decks, and only later on they were given a chance to catch some fresh air for a few moments. Otherwise, they were stuck in the tween deck. Here's one further picture. This is the man I'm coming now. So during the second half of the 19th century, steamships replaced sailing ships. In 1856, only 5% of emigrants arrived in New York by steamships. By 1870s, this figure had risen to 80%. Conditions on board were improved, and the voyage was reduced to 2 weeks on average. You can imagine a sailing vessel crossing could last much longer, for weeks and even months in some cases. And Hapag's new express steamers did the crossing in 9 days. The new ships could also transport much larger cargoes. While a sailing vessel conveyed only a few hundred people, the steamships had room for 1,500 to 2,500 passengers. Hamburg profited greatly from the enormous increase in immigration by Eastern European Jews fleeing persecution and pogroms, especially from the 1880s onwards. In 1891, a record number of nearly 150,000 people emigrated. That year, Hamburg overtook Bremen in the immigration rankings. In the 1880s, the first Hapag or HAL director, Alfred Godefroy, retired, and for a couple of years, Hapag's board consisted of merchants like Oscar Ruperti and Owald, who looked more after their own business than after the shipping companies. They lacked a perspective for the next decades and an interest in modernization of the fleet. While business stagnated in Hamburg, the North German Lloyd in Bremen built the first express steamers. In Hamburg, newcomers like Albert Ballin, you see a picture here, and Edward Carr provided strong competition. Ballin worked in the small immigration agency that his father had founded in 1874. By 1880s, he had succeeded to be in charge of the most successful immigration agency in Hamburg. On his initiative, Edward Carr began to ship emigrants to New York in 1881. Hapag had to react. In 1888, Ballin was appointed director. In 1899, board of the chairman of the Hamburg-America line. He took charge of Hapag's fortunes through turbulent times with a particular style of leadership. This was typical of the age. Passenger business was an important line for the shipping company. In 1891, Hapag built a new clearance hold on Großer Grasburg. They were subsequently extended. From these holds, tender carried passengers to where their ships were berthed. The following year, Hull built, by order of the state, barracks on the America Quay. These could accommodate a maximum of 1,400 passengers in 10 dormitories, where sanitary hygiene conditions were far from exemplary. They were only used for a short time. Hapag's success was largely dependent on immigrants. That was particularly evident in 1892, when the immigrant business was disrupted after the outbreak of the cholera epidemic in Hamburg. Thanks to Ballin's skill as a negotiator, setting up checkpoints at the frontier of the Reich, and the ensuing revival of the passenger business saved Hamburg from ruin. By 1900, the numbers of immigrants passing through Hamburg gradually picked up again. Between 1889 and 1914, 2.6 million immigrants were counted, equivalent to an annual average of roughly 75,000 per year. As numbers increased, the problem of accommodating them in the city again became acute. Especially the barracks of the America Key did not comply with sanitation and hygiene requirements. In 1900, Hamburg revisited existing plans for a large new complex of accommodation. The city, which needed the site of the American Quay for port expansion, made available sufficient land to Hamburg on the island of Veddel. This is one of the big express steamers, which shows you what possibilities there were for people to be stored in the tween deck down here, while the second class and first class were up here, and the holds down here. This was the place where the immigrants were found accommodation. Hamburg and Berlin improved the situation aboard. You can see there was more space for immigrants. There were no longer 6 people in one bed, and you can see in the canteen and where they had their food provided, it was much more comfortable and less crowded and cramped than on a sailing vessel. Here you can see the old part of the river where the vessels were berthed in the river themselves, moored at these poles, wooden poles in the water, and they have a special name called Dukdalben or Dukdalba. We don't really know why they are called that. It's probably got something to with the Dutch Duke of Alba in the 16th century. But nevertheless, that's the way the ship were moored in the water, in the river, and you can see the warehouses here at the side here. And these tender vessels provided room for importing goods and for taking immigrants and people into the harbor. I'll just switch over these pictures and come back to this. We were talking about that Hamburg had plans for a new location for the immigrants on the Elbe island of Veddel. The location was ideal because its own railway tracks on the city's outskirts. And the first phase of this, you can see these buildings here, they were built for the immigrants, and you can see that's the border here where in those days the railway line ran, and people who wanted to emigrate didn't have to enter the city of Hamburg anymore, which was here to the left somewhere. They were taken by train right to the Veddel Island and were brought into the new quarters, which in the first phase of construction in 1901 resulted in 15 buildings to accommodate 1,000 people. The new quarters were no longer called immigrant barracks. Barracks is a military term, really, and not very nice, but they were named immigrant halls. The site on which they were built was made available to Hamburg free of charge by the state of Hamburg. Roughly 25,000 square meters in area were located near the state's borders so that immigrants could arrive from special railway facilities and were taken aboard without coming in contact with the city. From 2007, here is an overview of the, in those days called Auswanderhallen here are the accommodation halls. This is the church here, and here to the side is a part which is separated from the rest as a quarantine place for people who had some sort of diseases and shouldn't mix with the rest of the immigrants. Yeah, and from 2007, the Ballinstadt, as it now is called, is located on the historic site of the Auswanderhallen and hosts the Immigration Museum with Hapag-Lloyd as a main sponsor. These are the buildings which have been re-erected according to the old plans. They are not the official, the original buildings. You have 3 sets of buildings where the whole history of emigration from Hamburg to America is told. Building accommodation for immigrants, and especially immigrant halls on the island of Veddel, would have been inconceivable without his initiative and Berlin's acumen. In the 3 decades between 1886 and 1914, Berlin made the Hamburg-America line to the largest shipping company in the world. At the outbreak of the First World War, Hull's fleet comprised 175 vessels. The company ran scheduled services to all 5 continents and employed more than 20,000 people. In 1860, Hamburg was an independent city-state with roughly 250,000 inhabitants, with worldwide trade relations and consulates in more than 300 countries. The old Niederhafen, within the former city walls, which used to serve shipping between the River Elbe and the Lake Ulster, was far too small. And I'll come back to the picture. Here we are. You've probably seen this yesterday, so you are familiar with the situation that this is the Niederhafen and this is the entrance to the old port. And in the area from 1860, they began to improve the situation here up to 1914, and they invited experts from Liverpool, from London, and from Holland, the Netherlands, to give their comments on whether it should be a dock harbour or a tidal harbour. The decision was made for tidal, which means that you don't have to build lots of locks and sluices, etc. And since we are quite a long way from the North Sea, the tidal range is not very high, so therefore it was possible, and Hamburg is still happy with that sort of decision which was taken in the 1860s. In the 1860s, a thorough modernization of the port facilities was started. In the end, the authorities decided against the dock harbour, like the London example, and adopted for an open harbour as the tidal change was not very important. Between 1863 and 1866, the Sandtor Basin on the Grasbrook was, you see the Grasbrook here, was the first artificial harbour basin with modern key equipment and steamer cranes. A railway connected the harbour with Hamburg's growing railway net. When Imperial Germany was founded in 1871, Hamburg lost its political independence, but they managed to achieve the Reich's consent to set up a free port. Since 1888, after the inauguration of the German customs union, the free port status remained untouched, and goods from all over the world could be landed, stored, processed, and exported again without taxes. This gave Hamburg's maritime traffic an enormous boost, which made enlargements of the port facilities inevitable. From 1871 to 1910, the numbers of vessels calling in Hamburg rose from 4,200 to 14,200. The goods traffic over the sea rose from 2.6 million to 22.1 million tons. If the immigration traffic is added and other factors taking like the Reich colonial activities, the founding of numerous shipping companies and ship and repair yards into account, as well, it is not surprising that new areas were needed, as you can see here, and the move was over to the other side of the river as well, where shipyards like Blumenfoss and others were built. The growth came to an uptrend in 1914 when the First World War broke out. Within 1 year, the turnover of goods sank from 22.5 million tons to 1.3 million tons. Albert Ballin, who foresaw the disaster once hostility would take over the rivalry between European powers, tried his best to act as a go-between with no success. In 1918, when the war ended, he saw his work in wrecks. His life ended from exhaustion in November 1918. Exhaustion means either he took too many tablets because he was exhausted, or he committed suicide. Nobody really knows the exact reason. So there's quite a lot of speculation about his death, but it doesn't make sense to argue. He died, he saw his work in wrecks. Thank you very much.
ª Cátedra Europa, el encuentro académico y cultural del Caribe colombiano y el mundo académico europeo. Europa se vive en el Caribe.